Hello everybody and welcome back to the Dovetail box series. In this video, I'm going to show you how to cut the pins for the dovetails. Let's get going. Okay, so with this part of the project, this is where things can start going wrong if they haven't already. And what I'm going to do with this is, in this video, as I just said, I'm going to show you how to cut the pin sockets, and then I'm going to do a separate video in the next part on showing you how to troubleshoot problems, what might go wrong and how to actually fix them, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with this, and there's a lot of different ways on how to diagnose and actually fix those problems. So it's going to be split into two. If your concerns aren't covered in this video, they probably will in the next one. And if you haven't already, please consider watching the student series for this project, where Rob will be making the project alongside me. So if he makes any extra mistakes that I forgot to cover, I'll show him how to fix them as well, so you can benefit from that experience as well. Let's get into it. Now, the pins are definitely the hardest part of the dovetails. As for the tails, they weren't too difficult. The only thing we needed to make sure that we got accurate was making sure that the end grain was square. The pitch of the dovetails didn't matter because in the previous part we traced around that with a knife, and we've got a perfect outline of whatever happened with those tails previously. As for the pins, we now need to get the top line accurate, and you need to get them perfectly vertical as well. So there's two things to get right in this stage. So here we've got the end of a blank piece of material, which we're going to represent as the pin socket. Now, what we've done so far is we've scratched a baseline with a marking gauge. That is not even whatsoever. Let me try that again. We've scratched a baseline with the marking gauge, and this has only been done on the front and the back. What I'll also draw on here is a face side, and face edge will be around the back there. So marking gauge line on the front, marking gauge line on the back, which we obviously can't see. And we have traced around some dovetails in the previous step on the top, and then squared them down to hit that baseline. And then what we've done is marked the waist, which is a very important step because it's really easy to cut out the wrong areas on this and thus get two negative shapes of the dovetail joint. One of you will do it, I guarantee it. So mark the waist on top, mark the waist on the front because we might as well. And there you go, that is our blank pin socket. Now, when it comes to sawing this out, obviously the saw cut has a width to it, which is called the kerf. A saw is not a knife, which as it goes into the material, it separates the fibers. A saw will remove those fibers. It turns it into dust. We all know this. So what you need to do with this saw cut is get it right up against that line. So essentially, you're looking to split that line in half with the saw cutting on the waist side of the line. So with this socket here, when we cut, the saw needs to turn all of this into dust. And you can see that it stops right up against that blue line. This one needs to cut on the inside, but the kerf stops right up against that blue line. Obviously, this is going to carry on all the way to the front, like that. You've got to put the practice in to get this right. And then we need that saw cut to continue down right up against that line and turn all of this into dust as well. Then, with those two cuts established, we'll then go down with a coping saw, whoop, cut across like that, cut back the other way just to get rid of this little notch here, and then chisel down to the baseline afterwards. The reason you don't cut on the line is because if, let's say, this turned to dust and we just overlap over that line, this will all be okay, but that remaining area that is overhanging the line, this little area here, represented by green, which contrast is rubbish, I know. Let's try purple instead. Will be a gap, which is why it's really important at this point to mark the waist side, because if you cut the wrong side of the line, then you've got a gap that is the size of the kerf of the saw, so whatever that happens to be. Now, as I said, this does take a little bit of practice to get right. With the saw that I owned before I got this one, I had that distance, that width on lock. I knew exactly how wide it had to be. I knew how close to the line I needed to be in order to split that line in half while cutting on the waist side. Since moving to this saw, the kerf was slightly different, but it was very close still, and it didn't take too long for me to adjust. However, with my Japanese saw, to be honest, I'm actually pretty bad at this. Because it's a much thinner plate on these, because they cut on the pull stroke, you see how bendy that is, I tend to accidentally cut too far away from the line when I'm using this, thus leaving material that I need to chisel down later. Now that's not necessarily a bad point towards Japanese saws, it's just simply that I haven't put in as much practice with one of these as I have with a Western style saw. Every now and then people will ask me, well, if you recommend Japanese saws for beginners, does that mean that Western style push saws are better for advanced people? No, it depends entirely on what you're trained with and what you're more comfortable with. If you start with a Japanese saw, you'll know how wide that curve is and you'll be able to continue using it with ease in the future. Whereas if you train with a Western style saw like I did, then you'll get used to the width of this saw. The reason I recommend the Japanese saws for beginners is simply for starting that cut. Cutting on the pull stroke is generally a lot easier and a lot more natural to people. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent there. So we're getting the pins up in the vise. Now what I'm going to do is put this so the face side is facing towards me and obviously I can see the top. I never cut these from the back because this entire face here is hidden once the joint is assembled, so I'm not really too interested about these lines on the back. Obviously, I need to get them vertical, but the ones I am worried about are these, and I want to make sure that I don't overcut them with the saw. So the front and top I would advise to be visible. Clamp that low in the vise so that it doesn't vibrate when you're cutting it. Now when it comes to cutting out these pins, I'm going to be referring to loads of my techniques in how to saw correctly, so if you haven't watched that, now is the time to go back and refresh your memory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put my thumb on the end grain, put the saw up against it, and then what you can do with this is just simply roll your thumb forwards and backwards, and that's going to give you the lateral movement with the saw. And that thumb is going to stay there while I get the end grain established. Now you can see that just by doing small adjustments with my thumb, I can get that saw plate right up against that line. And you can actually see the edge of the teeth catching it. Obviously, as I said, you don't want to overhang it, you still want to see the line, and I've angled the saw up, so when I push forward, I'm only going to take out that back corner. So I'm happy with the saw going there. Thumb is locked in place. I'm going to do a very light cut pushing forward and get the back established. And there we go. Now I've got a little point for the saw to lock into, and I've actually removed my thumb at this point and that is now stuck there. Now all I've got to do is very gently lower the saw down to continue that line cutting from back to front. Normally I promote doing long strokes with the saw when cutting, but at this stage I just sort of do little backwards and forwards movements like that, only using 3 to 5 teeth perhaps. And as you do it, blow away the dust as it's created, because that's going to start falling into the line and you're not going to be able to see it. There we go. So that is now the top established, and I can put the saw into that line, and now that can't go anywhere. And now at this point, it's where you want to start doing those long strokes with the saw. You've got all these teeth to use. You purchased them. You might as well use them. What happens is when people get cautious about this stage, they just do little nibbles all the way down, trying to descend that line really carefully. But all that causes is impatience, because you're not going to get anywhere by only using 5 teeth. You can establish a top line okay, but trying to descend 10 millimeters or whatever this is, it's going to take a long time. So what happens is people get impatient, they put extra pressure on the saw to try and make it go quicker, and then it causes the saw plate to bend. It means that the teeth are going to dig in, so you're going to have to put more pressure on it in order to actually get the saw to cut. And like in the case of this, it might go off at an angle. With a Western style saw, it's quite difficult to bend that plate. If you're using a Japanese saw, the plate bends very easily, which means that it's not unheard of to get curved cuts with one of these things. If you put too much pressure on that, it's going to bend. So light pressure with the saw and long strokes with it to descend that line. It takes a bit of confidence to do it. It is difficult to get your head around it. It does seem kind of counterintuitive, especially to a beginner, but it is something you need to do. Long strokes will get you much more control at this stage. So I'll get the saw plate established in the line. It's now locked in place. Now, saw plate, wrist, elbow, they're all in line with one another. Don't stand in front of the workpiece, because then your elbow's going to have to deflect around your stomach and you're going to get some sort of weird curved cut again. So stand to the side, look over the saw, look both sides of the saw plate. It's all covered in my video, how to saw correctly. Start on the push stroke to get maximum control, and then just commit to cutting that line vertical. Using all the teeth, and obviously don't cut below the baseline. Sorted. Let's show you another one in real time. So thumb in place, take out the back corner. Little nibbles, blow away the dust, lowering the saw. Top line is now established, saw's locked in there. Now we go to those long strokes, watching it descend down the line. And there we go, we've hit the baseline. So make sure to put a lot of practice into this step. Just get a scrap piece of material, square a load of lines across it with a knife, and then just practice cutting to those so that you, one, go right up against the knife line, and two, you get it vertical. Now, what I will say at this point is there are some people who prefer to chisel back to the lines in the sockets as opposed to cut to them directly with the saw. That's perfectly fine. Cutting to it with the saw is kind of a more traditional method that traditional woodworkers inflict upon you, saying that you need to learn how to cut to a line. But like, it's just one of those things. If you don't want to cut to the line and you prefer to chisel to it instead, and you get better results from doing that, then just do that. Don't get me wrong, cutting to a line is a very good skill in woodworking. It is something that you probably should learn. But if you don't want to do it at this stage and you would prefer to chisel back to them, then I'll be showing you how to do that in the next video, where I'll show you how to troubleshoot problems with fitting the dovetails. So stick around for that if you want to chisel back to them. For now, we'll just go with the normal method of cutting that waste out with a coping saw and chiseling back to the baseline. So with cutting out the waste in these pins, you've got a few different methods to do it. I prefer using a fret saw, which has a really fine blade, and it allows you to go down one of these cuts and pretty much make a 90-degree turn and go all the way across like that. And you'll see me do that later on. However, if you're using a coping saw, which is generally more readily available and is more commonly used in woodworking, should I say, a coping saw has a much thicker blade than a fret saw, which means that when you go down here and you try and make that 90-degree turn, the only thing you're going to do is bind that saw blade and probably going to snap it in there, which is a bit of a pain to get it out this corner, to be honest. So with a coping saw, with that wider blade, what you're going to need to do is go down to about halfway and then just do a much wider radius going down like that. And then you can sort of go back the other way and just finish off that corner afterwards. And just to address something that people have asked me in the past, as I said, I prefer to coping saw or fret saw out that waste. However, there are some people who chisel out that waste and they sort of like whack it down and do kind of like the V groove sort of thing that we did on the back of the tails. But they do that on the sockets, coming in from this side and then doing a V groove and coming in from the other. And like, I don't know the reasoning behind it, to be honest. If it works for them, if it works for you, then do it. But for those of you who are wondering what my view is on chiseling out the waste, then that's it. I don't know why people do it, to be honest. I just find that cutting it out and chiseling down to the line afterwards is much quicker, less noisy, and it means that I can maintain the sharpness of my chisels for a lot longer as well. But as I said, if it works for you, do it. So here you go, here's my fret saw. As I said, very thin blade, and this saw frame allows you to get a lot of tension on it. The number one reason for blade breakages on coping saws is detensioning. So by having a frame like this that allows you to get a lot of tension on the saw blade means that this is going to last a very long time. I've also oriented this blade so it's cutting on the pull stroke, because if you orient them so you cut on the push stroke, what happens is it pulls this end of the frame in and detensions the blade. Whereas if you orient it on the pull stroke, it tends to keep more tension within the frame, exactly as it would with a Japanese saw. So we'll go down the cut. As I said, it's a very thin blade. I can pretty much make that 90-degree turn in the cut. But here you go, we'll go on the nearest tail first. With the thin saw blade, I'll maybe go down to about 2/3 of the way from the baseline. I'll angle the saw slightly and then just start dragging back. And as I'm cutting, swivel the saw blade so that I'm now cutting horizontally. And then I'll work my way along that line. And as you get to the end, remember that you don't want to be cutting at 90 degrees to this, because you've got the angle of the dovetail to match. So just start swiveling that saw to match the angle of the pin, and out it comes. But this is why I orient the piece in the vise so that I'm looking at it from the face side, because if I was to accidentally cut into this back area with the fret saw by not matching the angle of the pins, then like that's not seen anyway. It's going to be hidden by the shoulder of the tail that's coming in here. So if you accidentally cut into that, it's not the end of the world, but obviously it's not something that you want to do. So just make sure to match the angle of that pin as you're about to separate the material. And many people ask me how close they need to cut to this baseline with the coping saw or fret saw. That depends entirely on how confident you feel with the saw. For me, I aim to get anywhere between 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter. That's usually close enough for me to chisel back to. However, if you're not feeling confident, then cut at 2 millimeters, 1 millimeter away or whatever. But using a lightweight fret saw with a very fine and taut blade within it, you will get so much more control at this stage, and it'll be a lot easier for you to get closer to that line and be far more agile and precise when it comes to making adjustments with this. This is the New Concepts fret saw, and that's new as in K-N-E-W. The one I've got here has a 5-inch capacity because you can get them in different depths depending on the work you're doing. And I've just got the one with the simple screw tension on the end. You can get them with lever tensioning, you can get them with swivel action if you need to, but for me, the screw tensioning, which is the cheaper one, 5-inch capacity, that does all the tasks that I ask of it. If you want to buy one of these, there will be a link to it in the description below. That will be an affiliate link. So if you purchase it through that link, I will get a small cut at no extra cost to you, and you get a shiny new tool. So I'll just do it once again in real time, down to about 2/3 of the way, angle the saw slightly, start working it back and forth, long strokes as always. And there we go, we're now going horizontal. Long strokes all the way through, and then match the angle of the pin on the opposite side and pop it out. Now, when it comes to chiseling out the waste, plant yourself in exactly the same position as you did when you were cutting out the tails of the dovetails by clamping the piece down so you're looking along the baseline of it. Once again, when you're chiseling this, you want to see if you're chopping at 90 degrees. You can't see that. If you're looking at it from this angle, you can only see the sort of tilt. Now, because this is a wedge-shaped cavity, we are going to need to somewhat look at it in order to make sure that we are matching the angle of that dovetail, but we can do that afterwards. The main thing here is to make sure that you're chopping at 90 degrees. So get the clamp, let's get that firmly secured to the bench. Now, just to reiterate the orientation of this piece, I am left-handed when it comes to chisels, so I've put it so my hand can just rest on the workbench, and then my mallet is on the other side, which is going to be over the material. This, I don't know why, but this just tends to be a little bit easier than doing it in reverse. It just becomes a little bit more difficult to see what you're actually doing with that line. So by swapping them around, you can just rest your hand on the workbench, you get a lot more stability, hold the chisel down the bottom as opposed to holding it at the top like a dagger, down the bottom like that, rest your hand on the workbench. And then what we're going to do is select a chisel that is slightly narrower than the width of this socket, because if you make it match the width of that socket perfectly, it won't fit on the underside where the wedge-shaped cavity has obviously got tighter. So we'll get one that fits with a little room to spare, and with this material, you don't want to put it straight into that line and make that chop, because, as I said before, it's going to push the chisel below that baseline and you're going to get a gap. So what we need to do is halve the material, get the chisel vertical. I've moved my hand out the way so you can see, but normally I would carry on holding it down the bottom here. And we'll go down to halfway. We're not going all the way through here. Break off that waste, halve the material again. Break off that material, and now the chisel can go into the baseline and take that final chop, making sure it's at 90 degrees. Once again, you can get a square in here if you need to, but usually your eye is quite good at seeing 90 degrees. The sound changes when you've hit the halfway point. Break off that material. And now, for these little corners, once again, we're going to keep halving the material, but you're going to need to slightly angle that chisel in order to match the angle of the cavity. Now, as I said, you could swap your vision, so you're looking at it from this way, where you guys are looking at it from, so you can actually see this. But to be honest, I will just carry on looking at it from this angle, and then just sort of angle the chisel roughly to match it. Go down to halfway, halve that material again, and then chisel will go into the baseline. A few taps at 90 just to get it established, and then match the angle of the socket. We'll do the same again on this side closest to me, half the material. And to be honest, that's now close enough to get into the baseline. So we'll just do a few taps at 90 just to get it established, and then match the angle of the dovetail. Now, obviously, I'm sure you guys can see that this angle is way too steep to match the inside of the sockets, but I'm just going to clean it out later. The main thing I'm aiming to do at this point is get the baseline established on this front face, and then we'll start cleaning out all the corners and stuff in there afterwards. So in real time, we'll do this socket closest to me, halve the material to the baseline, tapping down to halfway. And now that's actually close enough to get straight into the baseline. I'm looking to get it about 0.5 millimeter away before committing to the final line. Tap it down to 90, wait to hear the sound change. Now we'll do these little edges. So again, in fact, I'll probably just halve that. 90 degrees to start with, and then just angle it. The reason I go in at 90 degrees at the start is because if I match the angle of the dovetail straight away, you can see I'm only resting on that corner of the chisel, and it's got quite a lot of scope to pivot. But by doing a couple of taps at 90 degrees to begin with, and then angling the chisel, it means that you've got a lot more of it resting against the baseline on the left-hand side there. So we'll now flip the piece over and do exactly the same on the opposite side, coming from the other way. Now on this one, you can find a chisel that matches it quite snugly, and then just keep halving the material before committing to that final line. Now when it comes to doing these final chops, I don't normally bother trying to match the angle of the socket walls. I prefer to just go in at 90 degrees, which will leave me a little bit to clean out in the corners down here once I get this thing upright. But I just keep it simple here by going in at 90, because if for whatever reason I did try and match the angle of that socket and then go through and potentially damage the front face of the tails, because I'm looking at it from the back at the moment. If I damage the front face, then that's obviously going to be visible once the joint's assembled. So then we'll come around and get it upright in the vise, very low down, and we'll start cleaning out all these little fluffy bits in the corners. Now when you do this, once again, only go through to halfway, and then we'll flip it round and come in from the other side, working to halfway. If you go all the way off that back edge, then you're going to break out some material. What you could do to guard against this is clamp a bit of supporting material at the back of the socket, but to be honest, if your chisel's sharp enough and if you have enough control from it, you shouldn't really need it there. So we'll just go in like this, carefully wiggle it through to halfway, and I'll just make sure there's no fluffy bits in the corners. And then we'll flip it around and do the same from the other side. Now, depending on the material you're working with, you will sometimes get a little bit of crushing at the bottom of the socket here. It's not too bad with poplar, but if you're working with things like oak and ash and yellow pine particularly, yellow pine is a minging one for this, you'll get a little bit of crushing there where it's sort of where the fibres meet when you were chiseling in from the front and you were chiseling from the back. It weakens the material and they tend to split out of place as opposed to cut. If you get a little bit of crushing, as long as it's not on one of these corners, it's going to be completely hidden once the tail descends anyway. So if you've got a bunch of crushing happening in there, don't stress about it. Chances are it'll all be hidden once assembled. And then, providing that you've matched the angle of the tails perfectly with your saw cuts at the beginning of this stage, you've now got two things to check. One, do those saw cuts descend vertically? And two, is the baseline square to the front edge? So the first check, let's see if the lines are actually going down vertically. Now, because we scored these down with a knife, if they weren't descending vertical, then we would see a knife line on the front edge here. So that all seems to be okay. I'll just check the back as well. Seems to be okay, although I reckon the back of this one here, I think that's slightly sloping down in towards the socket, which has created a slight wedge shape. And if I check the back, there's a little bit of the knife line there as well. So to straighten that out, I'm going to get a chisel coming in from the side like this. I'm not going to do it coming from the top, just in case that splits in a direction that's not intended. So I'll come in from the side and maybe just carefully angle it out like this. Obviously not to that extent, because that's quite over the top, but I'm just going to slightly pull away the top of the chisel so that I don't damage this top edge, and just carefully work the bottom of that line. I'm literally just peeling away tiny fibres at a time here to get maximum control without breaking out any material, and then sever the fibres at the bottom. Now I'll just check again from the front. That's looking fine. Just going to flip it round and do a final bit of cleanup coming from the other side just to make sure that there's nothing left at the bottom there. And now moving on to the second check we need to do, which is making sure that the bottom of these sockets are actually square. So I've got the face side here, which will be on this face of the material, and we're looking at it from this angle, not from the front, we're looking at it from the side at the moment, hence why you can see the face edge. So I'll sort of draw a section view of where that baseline or where you've chiseled out thus far. We're going to be getting the square down from the face side and checking if that is actually square. Now, at this point, what you're looking for is for the square to touch here and here, which means what you can't have is a bump in the middle, because the square is going to touch there first, meaning that you're going to get a gap on the front and at the back of the dovetail joint. What that does mean is that you can do an undercut here, where let's not make a bump in the middle, but instead let's make a small dip like that. That's over exaggerated. You don't want it to be that deep, but at this stage you can get away with doing an undercut because the square is going to touch on the front and back edges, which are the only two parts of the dovetail you see after it's assembled. It's for the same reason that you can get away with that little bit of crushing in the socket, because once the tail goes in from above, it's all hidden. So when people are introduced to the concept of an undercut, they love it. It's mind blown. So what they'll do is they'll get the chisel in from the edge and they'll go boom, boom, and make a really, really deep undercut. Now, not only does that make you lose strength within the joint, but also when you plane down the faces to be flush afterwards, what you're going to start doing is exposing some of that undercut. And it's one of those things with a plane, when you're planing something flush, it's meant to make it look better. So when people see that gap, they think, oh, if I plane it more, then it will get better. But actually, it's making it worse because you're opening up more of a gap as a result of the undercut that you put in it. So instead, if you are going to do an undercut, it's best to go in at 90 degrees, as I just showed you to begin with, and then just doing a slight, like 1 degree, half a degree angle if you need to sort of make a small undercut. And obviously you're coming in at 90 degrees from this face as well, and then angling the chisel out. And that's just going to take a little scoop out, but it still gives you a nice 90-degree face, so you can plane down afterwards without opening up any gap before hitting the undercut. So it's one of those things worth knowing. I used to be an absolute fiend when it came to undercutting, but to be honest now, with where I position myself when I'm chiseling, I can quite easily see if it's going down at 90 degrees or not. And if I do get a small bump when I check it with a square, I'll just get it upright in the vise again, mark where that bump is, and then carefully chisel it out, working from both sides exactly as we did before. So now that we're happy that the walls are descending at 90 degrees and the shoulder line is at a perfect 90 degrees, maybe with an undercut, maybe without, and of course we're confident that we've hit the lines on the top of the tails, it's now time to check if they fit. So I've clamped the pin securely in the vise, light taps from above. You shouldn't be whacking this when you do it. You should just need light pressure, especially on something small like this. And when you do it, the areas you want to be watching are here, here, and probably there or there. Those tend to be the areas that split when you're assembling a dovetail that's too tight. It can occasionally split sort of here and here as well, but usually it's going to be that area there because there's not a lot of material supporting it and preventing it from splitting away. But this feels like it's going to bottom out quite nicely. And there you go, that is how you cut, refine and assemble the dovetail joint. Now obviously I've been doing this for a long time. It probably won't go as smoothly as this when you do it for the first time, which is perfectly fine. It takes a lot of practice to get this right. So as I said before, in the next video I'll show you how to remedy common problems that people have when cutting the pins for the dovetails. What I will show you now is how to disassemble this joint without breaking it, because the last thing you want to do is just start wiggling this all over the place, because it's going to start splitting the material here. If you're working with a softer material, you're going to start opening up gaps. You want to disassemble this in exactly the same way that you assembled it, which is by pulling the tails out like that. So what we'll do is lay the piece down on the tails. Do not lay it down on the pins, because if you do this, you are going to absolutely knacker the pieces that you're working on. Lay it down on the tails and very carefully lift the piece off the workbench about 1 millimeter or so. Just float it up as closely as you can. And what we'll do is tap as close as possible to the joint. So as I'm doing this, I'm tapping and lifting at the same time. And I can start to see gaps opening on the inside face here. And there's gaps opening on the outer face as well, which means we're getting somewhere. There you go. That is the easiest way I've found to disassemble dovetail joints without ruining them. Obviously it looks like there's a lot of potential for it to go wrong here, but if you're just floating it up a little bit at a time while doing small controlled taps close to the pin board, you should be fine. Like I say, just make sure you don't disassemble it the wrong way, because that is the orientation that dovetails are made to be strong in. It's not going to be pretty if you try and do it this way. So there you go. I do hope you found that lesson useful. If you're viewing this on my online school on my website, then scroll down and you'll find all the supporting resources available to this step. And you're now ready to move on to the next stage by clicking the link below, which will show you how to troubleshoot common problems when fitting dovetails. Press the big round subscribe button if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.